Hello.
Hello, hey, I'm Eckhardt Fuchs. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me? I cannot hear you.
Okay, let me check.
Sorry. Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Yes. Okay. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Yes. I just resent the link to the others in case they have lost.
Okay.
It's late.
На YouTube касни по 10 секунди.
Where can I switch that off? I'm sorry, I'm just figuring out how to switch off the YouTube. Where is the YouTube? Here. Okay, and now live stream. Yeah, where is this Zoom meeting? Okay. Okay. Yeah, now it should be all right. Okay, let's wait for the others also to join. Okay, here's Nena, Joanna, hi, Kit.
Hey, hello.
Yeah, Natalie's also here. Hello. Okay, the panelists, we're all here, so that's good. we had some technical issues with the YouTube streaming. We wanted to have the YouTube also streamed on our Facebook page, but for some reason that's not working. But we'll have the YouTube link on the Facebook, so I hope that's also okay. Okay, we wait 10 more minutes and then we can start. I'll be recording the session, so later we can also share it. Yeah.
Good evening.
Good evening, Natalie. Good evening.
Hello, everyone. This is Keith. Nice to see everyone.
I'm Joanna. Very nice meeting you.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
I'm Nena. Also nice to meet you.
Ah, you are Nena.
Yes, you are surprised. Did I change so much, Natalie?
No.
Okay, this was just a joke.
Maybe the white.
Okay, I mean, at the time, 5 years, I suppose, we didn't see each other.
How many?
5.
5.
Mm.
Wow. When we were cosmonauts.
Yes, of course, when we were cosmonauts in Berlin.
Hello to everyone.
Bravo.
Zdravo, zdravo. How are you?
Fine, and you, Petar?
Fine, thank you. A little bit hot in Skopje. Actually, very hot. But it's okay.
So what is the temperature?
I mean, it's more than 30 for sure, but it's humidity is kind of weird for this year. A lot of rain, something that we are not used to. To a rainy summer. So thank you for accepting to participate in this panel discussion. I hope it will be a very, how to say, constructive and a good debate. Yeah. We are really helping and trying to promote more and more debates in the society in regard to what is happening in relations with in this clash of narratives between Macedonian narrative, Greek narrative, Bulgarian narrative, and we're trying to also to promote to the society some different approaches and understandings based on from European experience, as European American, but also from the regional experience, and it's really helpful for the society that is really struggling between this traditional approach and nationalism and more open, let's say, understanding of the past. And it's almost every day we have these kind of situations where the two narratives of different countries are in conflict, let's say. Sometimes, and actually most of the cases, actually politicians are those who are leading the debate, which is not good. So that's why we're trying to promote a different approach and different views on the.
I would say that was the main motivation, right? There was so much lack of discussions led by academics and experts on the field. It is rather left to politicians, to journalists, partly to analyze and interpret the situation, which the whole history discussion ends up to day-to-day politics kind of talks. And then we said, okay, we should maybe start from even giving a theoretical background or something to start feeding the discourse in even from a broader perspective, even if we have to draw from case studies from other countries, just to actually open up space for other ways of thinking of history rather than what we see on day-to-day basis. Yeah, and I would say it's the upside of having such panel discussion at times of COVID is that most probably you wouldn't be able to come in person in Skopje if you would have the conference in like real conference. So we thought, okay, the advantage is that we can have some really renowned names in the field and online, and that's the upside, I think, of the whole situation.
So there is something good with the COVID.
The COVID.
So this is Keith again. I just have a question on like, what are you anticipating in terms of people coming in, and how can you run over again for us how it will work sequencing? Because and especially who will be who's going to be cutting me off if I talk too much. That's basically what I want to know.
So I will be the moderator for today, and the structure is basically the 3 questions that we have sent to you previously. So there will be 3 rounds of each of you reflecting from your own perspective and expertise on the 3 different questions, with maybe some questions or in exchange if that spontaneously comes, but basically that's it. And then as this is also being streamed on YouTube, there might be also some questions or Facebook coming from there. So there will be a Q&A sessions afterwards. For each of the answers of the questions, I would say 5 to 7 minutes each of you. And if you go beyond time, I can I don't know, I can raise my hand or write here in a private message. But I think if that's, as long as it's a reasonable time between 5 and 7 minutes, we can stick within our time limit.
But it would be good if you could make us a sign.
Yes, I will do that.
Yeah.
I think we can also start, but because I will be recording this and publishing later also on YouTube, I wanted also to invite the director of the organization to say a few words at the beginning. And he agreed, but he's in the other office and he should be online. But I don't see him online here. So I will just, if you allow me, just double check if he's joining us or he's not.
Okay. Are you gonna follow the chat? Maybe we just write down like an H for hand or something like that, so you know who wants to say something. It's probably easier than raising the hand. It's you know.
Yes. Yes.
But just write hand or H or whatever, and then,
then
you know who wants.
Yeah, there is also a button, raise hand. If you cannot find the button, here is Vincent also joining us. So if you cannot find the button, also just raise hand physically or write H. I will be following all possible ways. So yeah. Now I'm also joined us. Hi. and Vincent. So if you allow me, I'll just officially start. Good evening, everyone. I'm Biljana Volchevska, project manager at forumZFD and PhD student in the Institute for Cultural Inquiry at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. I'm really delighted to see you this evening for a discussion on cultures and politics of remembrance beyond Southeastern Europe, nationalism, transnationalism, and cooperation. I would like to give now the floor to Vincent Lunkwitz, who is the director of the Macedonian program of forumZFD, and just to give a little bit background about the organization and the way how this project came about. So Vincent, you would like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you very much, Biljana. Can everybody hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, Dobrodošli, Ms. Savini, and welcome also from my side. My name is Vincent Lunkwitz, and I'm forumZFD's country director for North Macedonia. Our organization initiated this conference, and I would like to take the opportunity to introduce us and our conference and to extend my regards to you. forumZFD is part of the German government's Civil Peace Service program that implements peace-building projects in over 60 countries worldwide, funded by the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. The organization was founded in 1996 in response to the Yugoslav wars and has worked in the region for 20 years now. In our Western Balkans program, we focus on the topics dealing with the past, peace education, and inter-ethnic relations. Today's and tomorrow's panel discussions are part of this year's international conference on dealing with the past, which is the fourth of its kind that forumZFD has organized in Belgrade, Sarajevo, and Pristina since 2015. There, the focus was on transitional justice, while in Skopje we titled it Cultures and Politics of Remembrance in Southeastern Europe, Nationalism, Transnationalism, and Cooperation, in order to adjust the conference to the local priorities regarding dealing with the past. I regret we could not meet again in person this year, but I'm very thankful to the organizing team that it was able to adjust to the COVID-19 circumstances. The Institute of National History Skopje, the Institute for Ethnology and Anthropology in North Macedonia, and especially my colleague Biljana Volchevska, who was the project manager for this activity. I would also like to thank all panelists for their cooperation, all participants via Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook for their interest, and my colleague Martin Filipowski for his invaluable technical support. I wish us all a successful and interesting panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Well, as Vincent mentioned, we have redesigned the conference, and now instead of having a physical conference, the conference will be a combination of online activities and a preparation of an edited volume. And part of the online activities are the two panel discussions that we are having today and tomorrow. So although the main focus of our conference is Southeastern Europe and the Balkans, today we are broadening a little bit the scope, trying to map concepts, problems, and issues of nationalism and transnationalism in studying, researching, and teaching history. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the speakers that we have today. I'll start in my virtual order, I would say, as I have all of you on my screen. First, I have Professor Eckhardt Fuchs. I apologize if please correct me if I don't pronounce your name correctly. Professor Eckhardt Fuchs is a research director of the Georg-Eckert-Institute. Previously, he has worked as a historian at numerous academic institutions, such as the Historical Commission in Berlin, the John F. Kennedy Institute at the Free University of Berlin, the German Historical Institute in Washington, and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. His research interest includes globalization processes in the education sector, especially those involving international organizations, global governance, education policy in Europe, the history of transnational education relationship, the global history of textbook revision, and the history of teaching materials. The next one on is Nena Stefanov. Nena Stefanov is a historian and research, Dr. Nena Stefanov, I'm sorry, is a historian and research assistant in the sub-project Phantom Boundaries in East Central Europe at the Humboldt University in Berlin. As part of the first phase of the Phantom Border Project, he examined the constitution of borders between Serbia and Bulgaria and their effect on local society. Under the title Across New Frontiers, Lines of Communication in the Post-Ottoman Context, Dr. Stefanov in the second funding phase asked whether and how lines of communication are changing. Using exemplary biographies of merchants and civil servants, it is analyzed whether and in what form the old connections between Sofia, Plovdiv, and the Ottoman capital Istanbul exist along the important Ortaköy transport route. He currently holds a substitute professorship at the chair of East and Southeast European history at the University of Leipzig. Then we also have Professor Natalie Clayer, who is joining us from the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences from Paris. Also is a senior researcher fellows at the French National Center for Scientific Research and at the Department Center for Turks, Ottoman, Balkan and Centralistic Studies. The main research theme of her early work was the history of the mystical Muslim brotherhoods in the Balkans and more generally in the Ottoman Empire. She was interested for several years in questions of identity and nationalism. The news also prompted her to study Islam at the heart of post-communist transformations. As part of collective projects, she has been studying transition processes from empire to nation state. Professor Clayer's research has concerned, on the one hand, the political and social transformation in the last years of the Ottoman era, and on the other, the questions of religion, power, and the formation of the state in Albania between two wars. In recent years, her work has focused on 5 main issues: religious pluralism, mobilization and state formation, networks, transfers and mobility, space, and biographical approaches. I'm also very happy to announce Joanna Wawrzyniak, who is also joining us today. Dr. Joanna Wawrzyniak is head of the Social Memory Laboratory at the Institute of Sociology, University of Warsaw. She's also a member of the Executive Committee of Memory Study Association. She's interested in oral history, agents of memory, economic nostalgia, and in the intellectual history of memory studies. She has been one of the conveners of Genealogies of Memory in Central and Eastern Europe project at the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity since its beginnings in 2011. Her recent publications in English include Memory and Change in Europe, Eastern Perspectives, Veterans, Victims and Memory, the Politics of the Second World War in Communist Poland. Then we have The Enemy on Display, the Second World War in Eastern European Museums. She has been a visiting fellow at a number of institutions, including the New School for Social Research, the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies, and the Herder Institute in Marburg. Thank you for joining us. The next speaker is Kit Brown. Kit Brown currently serves, if I'm correct, as director of the Melican Center, Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies. He's professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies. Previously, he was professor of research at the Thomas J. Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University. As well as teaching in Brown's interdisciplinary undergraduate programs in international relations and development studies, he led several collaborative and policy-oriented research projects focusing on conflict and its aftermath, civil-military relations, and transitions to and from democracy. He served as director of the Brown International Advanced Research Institute from 2010 to 2014, and director of the Watson Institute's postdoctoral program and the undergraduate public policy program from 2014 to 2017. He has also been a senior fellow at the United States Institute of Peace and a visiting fellow at the University of Connecticut Humanities Institute, and was a Fulbright Fellow at the Institute of National History in Skopje, Macedonia in 2012 and between 2012 and 2013. Now, I have introduced the speakers. I would like right away to start with the discussion so we can have more time to discuss and later on exchange involve the audience if as much as we can. I would like to open up the discussion with one question that is more general question, and it's addressed to all the speakers tonight. But of course, I anticipate and expect that everybody will draw from their own experience and their own research and reflect from their own perspective. So the field of history is radically changing, and it's changing because the world we're living is changing. We live in a world that aspires diversity as one of the highest values. In such context, transnational history is often seen as an umbrella perspective that includes a number of well-established tools and perspectives such as historical comparison, cultural transfers, connections, circulations, entangled or shared histories. However, in the context of a European cooperation, we are witnessing various processes in which the nation-centered historical domains are gaining or regaining relevance in the public discourse. Can these two perspectives coexist? And if yes, how would that look? Especially in regions where history can be highly contested with numerous outstanding unresolved historical disputes. I would like to invite Professor Fuchs. He's the first one that I see to reflect on this first question. If you could just turn on the microphone because we cannot hear you.
Okay, thank you very much for reminding me. Okay, I'm starting again. Thank you very much for this kind introduction and for inviting me to this exciting conference tonight. I would like to add one more thing to my biography. I'm here today, I think, as a historian who has done transnational history, so to speak, but I'm also here as a director of an institute that deals with textbooks and education and media, which is has been and still is very much involved in trans and international activity. So I'm basically on a theory side and on a practical side, and I will come back to that a little bit later. Well, the first question is a complex question and not easy to answer because it brings together two areas. It brings together the area of historical research on the one hand, and the area of public discourse on history and memory on the other hand. And these are two different realms. And so I want to address both of them first separately, and then I might be able to bring that together. First, again, then the realm of historical research. The term transnational itself was coined more than 100 years ago in the United States, but the debate on transnational history only started like about 2 decades ago. It started first in the US and then it spread over to Europe. And it eventually then, probably like 15 years ago, it led to what we call in historical sciences the transnational turn. So what is a transnational turn? The transnational turn, and that's very important to understand, is an approach to historical phenomena, an approach rather than a theory or a unique methodology. So it can be applied, this approach can be applied to any kind of historical research, be it political history or cultural history or economic history, intellectual history, you name it. And the second point that's very important, besides the fact that it is an approach and not a theory, it does not replace a national approach in historical research, but it adds on to national perspective by investigating, and you have said it in your question already, investigating the entanglements, the connections, the transfers, activities between nations and other entities, regions, or places. So it explains why certain phenomena in history became international or transnational without neglecting, in most cases, national specifics. So the transnational and the national these are not opposite terms, but they add on, they are linked. And when we look at historical research in the past decades, of course, we still have national approaches with certain methodologies, and we have a transnational perspectives, basically, as you said in the beginning, as an umbrella perspective, so to speak. So if you look at nationalism today, so and transnational perspective can, for instance, explain for different phases in history, including the present, why there's a rising nationalism. Because a rising nationalism is nothing new in history, of course, and transnational activities are not new either. So a rising nationalism in whatever period of time we talk about does not automatically mean that transnational relations or entanglements are decreasing only because there's an increasing nationalism. I think that's very important to understand. First of all, these are not opposite approaches. On the one hand, on the other hand, if you see a phenomenon on the one hand, it doesn't mean that the other hand vanishes or decreases or something like that. I could say a lot about like transnational research agendas, but I leave it with that for now and come to the second level, the public discourse on nationalism. Nationalism, in my view, per se, is nothing, if I use a moral term, is nothing bad, per se. Because we live in the historical age and stage of nation states for the past 250 years, and nation states define themselves through national history. The nation is in many ways still the point of departure for identity building. That's a fact, and we cannot neglect that. However, and that's my point, a nation-centered discourse, which is per se not bad, as I said, can be turned into a nationalistic one. And this is the rising phenomenon we observe today, not a national or nationalism discourse, but a nationalistic one, which becomes, of course, much stronger, and we have to be very much concerned with that. In the field of memory, I'm not an expert in memory studies, but it's even called history wars. And in the region we are talking about, we see and observe this kind of history wars every day. So these nationalistic views are value-based and not evidence-based, but they have strong political aims that need to be reconsidered. So what can historians now, switching between the historians, so the research field, and this public debate on memory on the past, which is, as you said in the beginning, highly contested, not only in this region, but in many, many parts of the world, what can and should historians do with a transnational perspective and with a transnational approach? Well, I think it concerns every historian. Every historian as an expert needs to get involved in those nationalistic public debates by disclosing the motives and values of such nationalistic discourses, by providing evidence and methodologically founded explanations. That is very important, and in many places of the world, historians very often say, well, we are experts, we have our field, but we are not very much engaged in those public discourses. But this is really needed. So it's not only historians who do transnational history, but it's a general responsibility of all historians, and not only the ones when we talk about transnational history. So to end up, transnational history as an approach in rising national public discourses, they are not a paradox, to answer your question. In my view, they are just different realms. They have to meet, and I think with the expertise of historians, no matter if they do transnational history or national history, as professional and experts, they have to interfere with this very nationalistic public discourse, as I said, that we observe in many parts of the world and not only in Europe. Thank you very much. No, we cannot hear you.
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much for reflecting on. Yeah, I'm very glad actually to hear that they, both of them can coexist. Although maybe in the future, in the next when the next speakers speak, I also would like to hear what are the advantage or disadvantage when one is dominating before the other. What kind of questions are missed when a research question might not be addressed at all when we are preferring only national history, and what kind of other perspectives are being opened through transnational history that can actually have maybe too optimistic from my side, but maybe can bring some positive social change even. I don't know. I would like to move to Nena, who also works directly with borders and phantom borders, the project, which I find it very interesting. Nena, go Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much also for the invitation. I should have been in Ohrid these days because we should have had a summer school, but due to the situation, you know, I'm not in Ohrid, I'm now in Piran in Slovenia. So I'm a little bit disappointed out of that, but nevertheless, I'm really glad that we can discuss here together. Just one thing, Phantom Borders, the project is closed, and we have now, I'm coordinating a interdisciplinary center crossing borders at HU Berlin now, but dealing again with borders, not only with phantoms, but with real borders also, and bordering and the limitations concerning societies. And this was also what I thought about. I reflected on your question was the societal dimension of what you asked, and I mean, we have to consider, of course, that history, particularly history, was always also a legitimation science of power. I mean, history served in all societies, be it in Western Europe, be it in Eastern Europe, legitimizing power, legitimizing it by telling the story. Particularly, we had this also in this authoritarian system of socialist Yugoslavia, but there, especially also with this particular spaces of, how to say, yes, a critical reflection, there was also a counterpart, let's say, cosmopolitic approach towards history, which is, I mean, close to a transnational approach. So this tension, I think it is in changing forms present the whole time. But what the specific was that by the wars for ethnic homogeneous territories, this kind of approach of legitimizing power of nationalist history was even more amplified in the several following states of former Yugoslavia. And this is something which until now seems to be dominating. But I wanted to point out something else. It's not only about the academic discourse I think we should take care of, but there is also another aspect. And this is, for me, connected to a rise of authoritarian attitudes at the end of the 1980s, particularly in Serbia, as the avant-garde of this kind of authoritarianism or populism we can also observe today in other parts of the world. And what then happened was that it's not only an academic discourse, but history was suddenly supposed in this 1987 period, 1989, to provide answers to all social questions beyond the academic discourse. Yeah, and it had to answer who is guilty for the crisis, where comes the economic misery from, who is to blame, why we have always been victims. I mean, this was a part of the discourse of Serbian nationalism, but it also was then transferred to the other parts of Yugoslavia. It was also very present there. So, and history serves to explain everyday life and everyday problems. And in Germany, in sociology, Detlef Clausen had coined the notion everyday religion, Alltagsreligion. In history is transferred to some kind of everyday religion, so departing from this academic sphere and something we see today in social networks. This is not a coherent ideology anymore, as this classical legitimation science history, but it is there are fragments of conspiracy theory. There are this self-victimization. This Kosovo myth is also can be also described from this point of view. So we have something that sociologists would have called in former times non-public opinion, where this kind of perceiving societal crisis by history. And I think this should be also consider when we are dealing with the academic discourse, that we now have some kind of interference, interrelationship between this academic discourse, which is fed by this prejudices and this dispositions in the society, and is again feeding this kind of dispositions, the societal dispositions. And this is something we should reflect on when we're talking also about the academic sphere. So this for the first question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It seems we're going to talk a little bit more about the two realms of academic and public discourse. Also, Eckhardt has brought that up. But Natalie, what is your take on this?
Yes. So thank you also for the invitation to participate to this debate. I think that what I wanted to give as an answer is crossing the previous answers, because first I wanted to say that in your question I was a bit embarrassed by this opposition between the sphere of the academic sphere, the sphere of the historians or history making people, and on the other hand the society and the public discourses, because I think that it's not so easy to oppose them as far as the approaches, transnational versus nation-centered approaches are concerned. So I think that it was already said that, and maybe I want to stress this, that everywhere, not only in the Balkans, but in the academic spheres, not only the I don't speak about the national approach, but the nationalist approach is also present. And so it's not, nationalism is not specific to the public discourses, or in the public discourses you have also discourses of the historians. And on the other hand, in the public discourses, you have not only one public discourse, you have many public discourses. And maybe, and here there is this notion of dominance. You said maybe we should have a look at what is dominant or not. Okay, so maybe in some places at certain moment, the nationalism is dominant in the public discourses, but also in the Balkans, there are public discourses that are civic, that are also representing other groupings. So not only they are not only nation-centered, but maybe also regional-centered, also local-centered, also professional-centered, etc., etc. So maybe they are not so dominant, but they are also present. So we should be aware of this multiplicity. Second, maybe something that was not addressed in the first answers is the importance, because Nena stressed this the period of the end of the communist regime in the Balkans, but of course also the issue of Europe, of the European community and its problems, and also globalization. Yes, plays they play a role in also in the emergence of maybe more nation-centered discourses and way also to make history. So both, but I think that here again one should also see maybe continuities. So these trends are not totally new. So what said Nena was an example. They are not totally new, and so they are nourished also by previous way of expressing such views, opinions, but these views and opinions, nation-centered, are re-articulated in relation with the new context. And it is also, so as Professor Fuchs underlined, so we have often kind of trends that are coupled. So when you have identity, you have alterity. When you have globalization, you have also a reconfiguration of identities at other levels. So, and my third point is, so should we, should the nation or an history made at the level of the nation, or should nation or the nation states be abandoned as objects of history for the historians? No, so it was already said. No, on the contrary, so they are to be taken very seriously. But parallelly to also to transnational approaches, to local approaches. So not every process, for example, is situated at the transnational level or translocal. And I will come back to this later. I think that the level of the existence, it was said, the very existence of the idea of nations and of nation states are to be taken very seriously and to be studied by historians.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I also hope we'll have more time to return to the questions that you opened and the points that you made. And I couldn't agree more that that it's irrelevant to talk about nation states history. However, my question, I would say, still remain, and I totally agree that there are even so initiatives, marginalized stories, voices, memories. But then the question comes, in which framework are they vocalized? When we have a history textbooks, when they only talk about national histories, militarized history, and there is hardly, at least I'm talking the context where I'm coming from, where basically the Balkans, then is the question, how do we but we can come back, I hope, again to this question. But this, I think, it's a nice transition to Joanna, who is actually coming from memory studies, and maybe can reflect a little bit also on the interdisciplinarity of history and what can memory studies do for it.
Yeah, well, my background is sociology and history, but I try to present myself as a memory scholar. And in what I'm going to say, I will try to combine these three perspectives by trying to, and I hope my colleagues, like historian colleagues, will forgive me that for a moment, by trying to understand history as a form of memory. It can be the so-called cold memory, as Jan Assmann has called it, but still it's one of the representations and collective representation of the past we might have. That's one thing. But the other, I think, it's in the discussion we are having, it would be great to ask a kind of the sociological question. Who is making transnational history, and who is benefiting from the transnational turn, and who is benefiting from who is writing national histories, and who is benefiting from this kind of the turn. So kind to look at the agencies, the real agencies right now in Europe and beyond, who benefit from this different kind of discourses they propose. So with transnational history, I think the answer is quite simple. It is being written and being made by highly educated multi-language scholars who can travel and benefit from that kind of the intellectual exercise, which is transnational turn. And then who can benefit from the national history? Mainly the local historians who find their own publics locally. And I think that is even more kind of important right now in the margins of Europe, where I'm based. And so when I spoke to, when I had Peter saying about the problems in Skopje right now, and we are having exactly the same in Warsaw with this clash of discourses. So part of the elite, also of the intellectual elite, aspiring to that cosmopolitan transnational discourse, and part of them pretending to stay with and reinvent the more familiar national discourses. So that's this, I think it's a kind of as I said, sociological question we might ask about the agencies behind this two types of historiographies, which are both professional historiographies, but they might also become the public history, and they are somehow transferred via foundations, associations, museums, and all this kind of the work into that what we call public history. So then we can also ask what is attractive, right, in both transnational and national history. And I was mainly concentrating in my exercise about that, about what is really attractive in national history today. So why we are actually facing that national, the national regaining an impotence right now. So one thing I think it's obvious, it's familiarity of the national discourse. So you do have even if the national is constantly reinvented, you do use some traditions, and most importantly, the language with which you have already worked with. It's also kind of the search of the usable past in the time of globalization, in the time of the uncertainty, when people do prefer to hold to that what they know better. But the more important answer, I think, it is that national history gives that what the cosmopolitan transnational history doesn't give to the people, which are the emotions and passions. And there is this beautiful model recently developed by Anna Centobull and Hans Christian Locke. After the Chantal moved, they transfer her idea into memory studies, and they propose to look on that what's being done with the memories in the public sphere in the terms of cosmopolitan, antagonistic and agonistic form of memory. So they would say that this transnational discourse, it's a cosmopolitan kind of the discourse which is based on, first of all, on the human rights discourse. It's victim-centered, but it's in a way cold, in the sense that it doesn't really understand or somehow interplays with the passions and emotions involved in the history making underground. So into that, they, with this kind of the cosmopolitan discourse, they contrapose to that the agonistic discourse of national histories, which they usually very much emotion driven and very often very agonistic, because, you know, these nationalistic discourses, they often need enemies and things like this. And they do also propose this third concept, which is the concept of agonism, and we might come back to that later, because this is actually the solution to the problem, because they look for a balance between the cosmopolitan and agonistic memories of today. So yeah, and finally, I think that the point which I really would like to make, that this nationalistic turn is something which is a language of expression for the local elite, which will not find itself in this big cosmopolitan or transnational sea. And, you know, there is this saying that it's better to be a big fish in a small pond than a small fish in the big pond, right? So when we have this national revival in which public historians and professional historians very often participate in the countries, at least of Eastern, Southeastern Europe, it is because they do not always find themselves heard enough in this transnational realm of history. So I think I can finish with that point right now, and perhaps later come back to some of it.
Yes, thank you. That kind of sociological reflection could be very useful in understanding the boat in terms of which purpose they might serve, or whose agendas they might fit. I was wondering, as we are hearing, for my own understanding, transnational is usually understood as something looking from maybe distance or from some kind of broader connections, but that actually is not always the case. It can be a very concrete, one connection between one kind of dynamics happening between agents in history, and that kind of micro perspectives can have transnational character and can give voice to historical agents that haven't had any voice previously. And that's why actually Kit, you had, if I'm not mistaken, such approach in one of your previous research. It's not necessarily transnational, but it is a micro approach. When you go you zoom into, it was the Wawrzyniak, right, research, and you brought up something that Macedonian historians I never heard being interested in such issues, and that brought up that brings to light some kind of historical events that are very, very different in the way they're told from how we learn about in history books. Kit, I would give now the floor to you.
Thank you, Biljana. Thank you for the invitation. What a great introduction you gave me. So yeah, just to add to the generous introduction you gave me, I realized that bio I wrote when I was still very much in thinking about the things that I did over 20 years at Brown. Now, didn't actually crop up in my bio. I'm actually at Arizona State University. That's where the Malikian Center is. I'm directing a center there. And I took the liberty of just preparing a slide for each of my three pieces. And in all three pieces, I'll be, as Biljana said, I am very much interested in the micro approach. And so the way that I respond to the paradox, as we framed it right now, is to sidestep it or work out a way to bring the local into engagement with the global. And one way that the local that engages with the global is through the container of the nation state and nationalism. But that's a very historically contingent and specific way of articulating between local and global, which people have said it's been around for 250 years. And I would say, yes, it's only been around for 250 years. That's not a very long time in the great span of things. So what I've done, I just responded to the three questions just by, I want to flag three cases, three micro studies, and just talk very concretely about these questions. And so this is, this map is an artifact, which is sort of my effort as a social science grounded historian to actually provide a new way of reading a short text from the French archives, where the vice consul in Skopje, Max Schublin, just gave an inventory of the weapons that had been seized by Ottoman authorities on their way to the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization in 1903. And so there was quite a bewildering array of weapons mentioned, and it got me thinking, out beyond that nation state again, where does the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization in 1903, between 1893 and 1903, get its weapons from? Because if you're an armed insurgency, you better be armed. So anyone who's looked at Loyal Unto Death maybe remembers this story. I just want to add a little bit to it and flag the keywords that I responded to Biljana's invitation to think about some of the terms that are important in our own research. So the particular weapons that I've been tracking most faithfully are the martinis, and in particular the Peabody martinis, which were represented in this weapons cache. And it turned out, I learned as I kind of dug around, and I accept the commentary that we have the privilege and the luxury to dig around, but I also find the leveling effect of so much material now being available online and so many rabbit holes being available to us from our own desks, that I'm not sure that it's necessarily only the case that being in the US, I get the chance to delve into these things. So the Peabody martinis that ended up as part of a weapons cache uncovered by the Ottoman authorities and written about by a French consul in 1903 were built in Providence, Rhode Island, and were shipped to the Ottoman Empire as part of an arms order for 600,000 rifles placed by the Ottoman Empire as they were modernizing. And it's for me, it's a very compelling story because it takes it's made possible by the overextension of the arms industry in the United States, and particularly small companies in the Northeast who were supplying the Union Army during the Civil War, and with the end of the US Civil War suddenly found themselves with excess production on their hands. And for the next 20 or 30 years, while some of those companies transformed their production lines to produce other things, a few of them got involved in the international arms trade. And so we've got this really, for me, interesting story of Providence businessmen and was a small Providence company in New England landing this huge deal with the Ottoman army, the Ottoman Imperial Army, and the sort of pathway of who the brokers were, who the middlemen were, what happened with the freight, what happened with the finances, is for me a sort of way of looking at history where we put objects at the center. And in this particular case, we tell a story about the end of an empire and the use of weapons originally bought by that empire by internal forces committed to destroying that empire, that is the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, the Albanian national movement made extensive use of these Peabody Martinis. A lot of them ended up in the hands of Arabs and Arab allies of the British during World War I, again used against the Ottoman Empire. So you see this kind of escape, the way that objects escape the purpose of the agents that put them into circulation in the first place. So to enable us to draw from some of the theoretical discourses happening outside history, especially those that, as I said, write the history of objects, or look at the production chains and distribution flows and the financial flows around those objects, as a way to, for me, sort of break through this impasse. Because for me, this is a much more interesting, compelling, and intimate story of what the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization was up to than the assumption that the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, the only thing that the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization cared about was that in 100 years, a political party would be celebrating its legacy as the birth or the consolidation of national consciousness. So there's a way to sort of get past, I think, the sort of ideas and emotions that that political elites try to mobilize in different publics and bring publics together in the modern world, and actually reach past that fog and actually get people interested in what actually happened. And for me, object flows are one way to do that.
Thank you very much, Kit, for this great presentation. It was very interesting, actually, and very interesting to know, and I never heard about it before. If you allow me now, I would like to move to now. Yes, Fuchs has the question, I think.
I'm not quite sure. Are we entering a discussion right now? Are we doing the 3 rounds? I would really like to say something about Joanna's contribution and that's one. I mean, but I don't know. We can postpone the discussion after we have.
No, I
questions, whatever.
No, I think we shouldn't stop the flow. So if there is need for discussion, we should definitely discuss. So please go ahead, and then we'll move slowly to the next question.
Okay, thank you very much. I found the contributions very interesting, and especially Joanna, what you said from your sociological perspective, the differentiation between professional historians who are the elite and are cosmopolitan because they can and have the means to travel and to do the transnational. So they do transnational history and they practice transnational history because they can. And then the local historians who bring up with national history the emotions and passions. I find it very interesting. I haven't really thought in that perspective. But there are 2 things I think I want to add to that. First, I think, and there are a lot of local historians who do transnational history. That I want to. So we have a lot of, not a lot, but many examples where really on a very local level, and it was said before, on a very local level, they look at those transnational whatever activities, Keith just mentioned objects that were transferred from here to there. So I don't know if this really is the differentiation between the transnational and national approach. But my other point is since you talked about agency, I think when we talk about public discourse, there's a 3rd and 4th agency, and I have the feeling that those 3rd and 4th agency, and I will name them in a second, that they are dominating this public discourse. Of course, now we should talk about what do we understand under public discourse. Maybe we have, of course, all of us different opinions about it, because of course professional historians participate in public discourse too. But I think what you have in mind with your conference is some kind of other public discourse. So what I have in mind is laymen and politicians. And if I look at these contested debates, then I see in those discourses, and especially on the internet, but also in other media, that laymen claim that they know better about the history, right? From their own experience or whatever, from their political opinions, whatever. So they go out there and they claim certain things, but they don't have, let's put it that way, and I don't want to sound arrogant, they don't have expert knowledge, but they bring it in. And of course, especially in social media, they have a huge influence, right? And where are we as historians, no matter if we do a national or transnational history? And the other ones are politicians. They bring up, of course, we know how much they shape memory politics. That's why it's called memory politics. But they are in a public discourse. And if I look around and say, who listens to me and who listens to politicians when it comes to the interpretation of history and how you make it dominant in a discourse, then I would say my role is very much limited for several reasons. But my point is basically to empower, historians, no matter if they're local historians or, let's say, professional transnational historians, as you framed it. So these two other agencies or actors, laymen of all kinds and politicians, they need to be considered when we talk about like this contested public discourse or the contesting history interpretations. Thank you.
Thank you, Eckhardt. Does anybody else wants to comment or add something to this?
Can I just briefly answer?
Yeah.
Just very briefly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
Because it develops the framework. So obviously I do agree with your first point. I was just too simplistic. With this 5 minutes, I know I need to stick to the time. But yes, obviously, so we can complicate. I mean, especially I would say on the fringes of Europe, there is this interesting generational turn, because there is now the new generation of historians educated at several Western universities coming back and kind of combining, the skills and knowledges. So that, there's plenty of ways we can look at that, but still, I would argue that there is a tension between maybe not national, but nationalistic turn and the transnational turn. And we can look for some key agents of those discourses around Europe. And yes, the second point, absolutely also fully agree. I was also thinking, about this European project term, which perhaps might be even better than layman, which is stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders of the historical discourse, who are not necessarily trained historians, but history is important for them to express their identities. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to add something? No. Okay, then. I'll move to the second question. It's about historical revisionism, which perceived in its narrow scope is a process imminent to history as a science, and thus immune to normative interpretations. However, from a wider socio-political perspective, this process attributes meaning to various public discourses, events, and meanings. In the Balkans, for example, it happens often that authorities are all tenaciously engaged in shaping memory. They adopt a cherry-picking and identity-driven approach in molding memory politics in revisionist fashion. What is your take on this? Can we conduct a clear-cut history-memory distinction in this regards? And I must add to this, from the discussion that I'm hearing now, we hear on one side that national history coexists with transnational history, or there is a potential for that, and they're not opposing each other. However, on the other side, the way history is being taught for centuries, it's very much, at least in the Balkans, 19th century kind of way of telling history. Is there a need, or is it maybe too strong the word, for a paradigm shift in the ways how history is being taught? And do you think there needs to be a radical change? Okay, we need to change the ways how we're teaching history, how we are presenting history, especially to the youth. And this just came now as inspiration for me. We're hearing here the discussion so far. So, and when is revisionism kind of an absolute risk that needs to be taken when we have to kind of restudy some things or see them from a different perspectives? And when is actually a dangerous kind of realm when it's taken in the hands by politicians and it can be misused. So I'm sorry if I opened up too many questions. I hope you can all pick up on at least part of it or some aspects of the things that I just said. Eckhardt, since you are actually very much engaged with textbooks and have done a lot of research, but also working directly with the Institute on these topics, could you please say something about your experience at this?
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, I don't want to focus the whole discussion on textbooks, but what you just pointed out is in my view, a very, very important aspect, because shaping memory and education are very, very deeply interwoven. When I talk about education, then about, of course, the material that is used in schools or for education in general that have to do with history. And I mean, your judgment that for centuries, or maybe not that long, but let's say for the past 150 years, that the national narrative is the central part of history textbooks, that has not changed. And why shouldn't students in Germany not learn about German history, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But, and here comes the big but. Textbooks, of course, are carriers knowledge that one generation wants to basically carry on to the next one, and the content and norms included in textbooks are normally a result of negotiation process in a society. And here it comes because your question, of course, mentions authorities. Education in all countries in this world, as far as I know, are still a matter of governments. There are ministries of education or other political stakeholders who have a very, very strong influence on the contents of what is taught in schools, and especially in history class. Yet, in many societies and many countries, this is not like done by the Ministry of Education or by a president of a country, but as I said, by negotiation process. And decisive for this process is that is based on democratic values and standards. So basically, all stakeholders that have to do with education have to be heard. Everybody has a saying. There are commissions, committees that negotiate the contents of textbooks. And what you said is right, but of course, in the past, I would say maybe 2 decades, or maybe a little bit shorter, we see a shift in many countries when it comes to the way in which history is taught in schools. And we call it, of course, multi-perspectivity and things like that. I don't want to go into that. But what is most important is we are not going to, and I don't think that should be done, change a national or national-based narrative. But what should textbooks do is they should allow different interpretations, other views from other countries. We have a lot of textbook conflicts between 2 countries, sometimes are more, but it's between 2, where basically one country doesn't even, or students doesn't even know that students in the other country have another perspectives and why. So this needs to be incorporated in those textbooks, and I think in many countries we're on a good way. Certainly not in Macedonia and in Greece and in other areas in southern Europe. So what I mean here is that authorities or political stakeholders are part of it, and they cannot be excluded. For the third question, then I have some answers to that. Here I just leave it with a statement. So we cannot exclude it, and they don't have to be excluded. What is very important is that authorities basically allow a variety of interpretations and can tolerate it. That's very important. And where you have countries where this is not the case, for whatever reasons, where they don't allow the plurality of historical narratives or memories, then of course it's very problematic. There are ways to do it, but that's your third question. So I'm going to say a little bit more about it later. But here again, my argument is a recontextualization of a national history in textbooks. It's possible, but in most countries of the world, or in many countries of the world, it has not happened yet because of a very strong political influence, an influence that does exclude other agents in society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I will move now to Natalie. Natalie, what? I just if you could just switch your microphone.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yes, I think that if we take the example of France, a country where the let's say the populists are not yet leading the country. So here also we see that, and it's like that. The political leaders are shaping the public memory. It's a common process. So I recently was hearing at TV. It was 2 days ago, and there was a reportage about the Macron in the last month and his action in shaping very much himself the public memory. So not speaking about the textbooks. So I think that we don't need to go to countries where there are authoritarian regime to see such things. But maybe there are differences, and maybe in France we can say that still critical thinking, because I think that not only the multiplicity but also the apprenticeship of critical thinking, it's also very, very important for the education of people. So maybe so to when I prepare the answer to this question, I wanted also to speak about this triangular relation between political leaders, historians, and public opinion in shaping memory. But maybe I just thought that we are forgetting also family memories and family and individual memories, because so education, school is very important, obviously, but also still the family, maybe also the social networks, but and here it's also maybe in introducing family memories that we can think about, in fact, the de facto existing multiplicity, but maybe with this problem of hierarchy and of the dominance, and but so it's I'm just giving you this idea. And in fact, it was to answer this question that I wanted to tackle the issue that Joanna already tackled, so the sociological dimension. So thinking about the revisionist historians who are there, all the other ones, even if I don't agree really with this dichotomy between revisionist and on the other side transnational historians. But so I had also the impression that it was a bit too simplistic, this opposition between the intellectual, cosmopolitan, and traveling all around, and the other one. But I think that if definitely we have to try to understand who, so the agencies, as you said, Joanna, and who is having which position and why. But I think that the problem is what are their constraints, their possibilities, their personal views, maybe their sensibility, because it's also very personal, sometimes very personal issue, their social positioning and their political positioning. So it's far more complex. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Natalie. Joanna, do you want to continue and also add your thoughts on this?
No, just going back to Natalie, I totally agree with you that we can find it complicated, and that's thank you for that, because I fully agree with it. Coming maybe to your initial question. Well, first of all, sometimes I'm being a professional historian, and as such, I would to keep politicians far away from what I'm doing. But I mean, they always, I think, it's deplorable that they do that, but they have to do. They have always done it, and they will always do that. So we just have to live with that. And I think that happens in most of the country of the world. That there is kind of the memory politics or history policy. History politics, you can name it as you will. As there is welfare policy, as there is economic policy, as there is some other politics. But the question is how to organize it, right? And that's what has been already said by my predecessors, that it's good to have it organized in a way that it's multi-perspective. But it's in a way easy to say. It's easier to organize in certain countries, and in some countries as ours, it becomes really difficult. So even after Poland is an example, that there has been, or there was a kind of the big attempt to reorganize the history education in such a way that that the country becomes more, the students become more aware of the, let's say, multinational origins of the state in which they live, which has been totally nationalized by the communist propaganda, paradoxically, after the 1945. So, myself, when I was in a school in the a small kid in the 1980s in the school, I would not know that the Western territories where I go were German. That was something which was hidden within the Holocaust stories. That's another threat which has been always, but the Ukraine, Belarusia, Lithuania, we have the very complex histories with all our neighbors, and there were big attempts to change that narrative so that we can live together with, or the students can live together with these different sensitivities and with some way to comprehend that in the common Europe, right? So, but right now there are attempts to kind of renationalize the agenda again. And there will be a struggle, right, between the two. And those who win, they will, win for some time or even for longer. And I obviously don't have the better answer to how to stop that, or besides of that, they need to be some kind of the, at one hand, professional, and on the other democratic way of organizing that, how to teach the history of the schools and to have different stakeholders involved. But that's not very easy to do. If there are some people and some agents in the field for whom the history is, as my colleague in my institute, Michał Łuczewski, says, it's kind of the moral capital. So they say the things they are right, and because they are right, they can rewrite the history books again, because that's the point. Oh, and this is, yeah, so this is where we can only, you know, discuss the thing, try to explain our perspectives, but we might be just too weak for that. No. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. I will not go now into further questions or comments. I'll just move directly to Kit and then Nena, and then maybe we can have a discussion on everyone. Yes.
Thanks. So I just, I should have said this, I think, I can't remember, I think Natalie already mentioned the French context for restrictions on pluralism and how important government leaders can be. So for those of you who aren't following US politics right now, one of the most recent of the many surprising turns in President Trump's decision-making has been a declaration of unhappiness with the 1619 project, which is an award-winning effort led by some journalists to more systematically thread through US public understandings of the creation of the United States, the foundational role of slavery in that process. And in one of the latest efforts in the culture war, President Trump has threatened to withdraw public funding from any schools using the 1619 project in their classrooms. So it's a kind of reminder that these are not just issues in the region that we're all interested in. And just as a second note to that, if anyone can help me find the original reference, I thought it was Kemal Krspahic who made this commentary at the time of the early 1990s. To a US audience. He said, well, imagine if David Duke, the segregationist leader in the US, imagine that he had controlled your media for the last 10 years. And think about what relations between members of different groups would look like in the United States. And here we are 25 years later, and David Duke hasn't controlled the media for 10 years, but it feels as if some of the messages being put out on US media are certainly feeding into the current conflicts in this country around the teaching of history and understanding of plural narratives. So that said, this is my second effort at microhistory, and it speaks very much, again, to something Natalie pointed out, the importance of family history. And again, it's an effort to suggest that their microhistory and community history and a deeply grounded local history can actually sidestep the nation state. So this is but also I think one of the things we certainly as an outsider to the historical field, to the use of archives, one of the challenges we grapple with is that states are producers of the raw material, and states produce more documentation than, let's say, illicit insurgent organizations. They produce some of their own documentation, but they're not as scrupulous about it as states. These are a couple of documents, again, pulled off, accessible to anyone with an internet connection and a subscription to Ancestry.com. The resources that are now available, for example, to track the immigration records through Ellis Island, where we can identify the ways in which people originally who are originally recorded as Macedonian in terms of race or nationality, when they arrive in Ellis Island, how in the process of turning those statistics into mass data, that initial inscription is overwritten with Greek, Bulgarian, or Serbian. So we can do that now much more easily than having to go to DC. So again, I want to make an argument for the positive potential of internet access if we can somehow persuade our 12-year-olds and our 15-year-olds that historical research is actually just as interesting and maybe more compelling than following the latest Twitter feed from a politician. We've really got the opportunity to, as historians and scholars, to actually provide sort of fuel for curiosity and imagination that at the moment are being colonized by the emotional brokers who are our political leaders. So what you have here are two documents from the life of Magdalena Dundov. So her marriage license to Tashko Dundov, a member of the Macedo-Bulgarian community in Steelton, Pennsylvania, from around the 1900 through to his death in the 1940s. And on the right is her death certificate, where if you can see that the cause of death is the body was burnt by an explosion caused by the gasoline tank of an automobile, and it indicates it is accidental. Tashko Dundov was detained for a while after his wife burned in a car when he was completely unscathed in the early morning hours of September 1928, less than a year after their marriage, and less than 3 months after he had taken out a large life insurance policy on his wife, and less than 2 weeks before a substantial debt that he owed became due. So he was detained briefly, but released after legal investigation couldn't provide evidence, couldn't provide firm evidence because the body had been so thoroughly destroyed by the fire. So there was no way to provide evidence that Magdalena had in fact been rendered unconscious before she burnt to death in a car, again with her husband standing next to the car, unscathed. So it's a kind of interesting case of, for me, of a kind of historical detective case that we can get into, and what these documents tell us alongside other documents that as historians we can access is that Tashko Dundov was a prominent leader of the local chapter of the Macedonian political organization, so heavily engaged in fundraising in the US in order to supply material resources to the then revolutionary organization based in Bulgaria and very active in then South Serbia, including Dundov's hometown of Prilep. So there's a kind of tangled history that runs through a community, a tight-knit community, where Dundov was able to sort of, as both a political figure and a leader in the church, and as a businessman, was able to was able to persuade people to stay quiet about things, and was able to get away with practices that, to our eyes, look which were deadly for some people who crossed paths with him. So the keywords here I wanted to flag again. It's in the spirit. I mean, this is obviously our own version of cherry picking history, but it's a way that I think to sort of illuminate again that the transnational and the global are embedded in very local stories. So here we have a community in Steelton largely comprised of migrants from the same town in Macedonia, Prilep, who married, and there were marriages outside the community. So Magdalena was actually from Baranya, which was on the border of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She had worked as a cigar maker. She actually had her own house. But she ends up dead and forgotten, and her death goes unnoticed, and no one is ever held accountable for this. It's judged accidental by a jury comprised of men, and influenced clearly by this by the local sway that Tashko Dundov had created for himself. So it's a reminder of the ways that just the long history of migration, displacement, the place in economic life of the Western Balkans of labor migration and remittances and long distance connections as intimately woven into the fabric of life in ways that again sidestep or don't really take enormous account for long periods of modern history of a national government. In this particular case, it's also a reminder that at times in its history, the Macedonian Revolution Organization was forced to operate as a criminal organization, which put its leaders in the precarious position of folks operating in a mafia-like structure. And so there are ways in which this is a kind of intimate and possibly uncomfortable and possibly seen as demeaning dimension of history, but there is nothing, there's nothing distinctly Macedonian about this history. It's a familiar history from organized crime in the United States. As with the story of the rifles, it's a reminder of these intimate connections and the ways that, as Seton Watson wrote in the 1930s, sort of violence has been plowed into the countries of the Western Balkans and for the people of the Western Balkans by forces outside that region. And so it's an opportunity to recognize that and explore some of those stories. And again, I just finished by this discussion about textbooks. One of the things that I think I'm always, I studied hard sciences until I went to college. And I remember the sort of sense of betrayal I had at age 18 when I was first taught that electrons had mass. In other words, as a 12-year-old, I was taught that electrons were massless, and because it's a simplified model of the atom, right? And we all accept that we give 12-year-olds a more simplified model of how science works than we give university students. So I'm always curious how we feel as historians about that relationship. At what point do we, you can't hit the 10-year-old with, well, everything is multi-perspectival, before you know where you're standing, let me cut the ice out from all around you and see if you can swim, right? There's a kind of, there's a scaffolding that operates when we teach science. And the question that I'm always struck by is what's the parallel for that in history? Like when and how is the time to complicate these narratives? Given, as various panelists have pointed out, the fact that we're operating in a world where the legitimacy of the authority, the scientific expertise is continuously being challenged, right? Because history, when we introduce multiple perspectives, we're always told oh, so there's no truth, so so it doesn't matter, it's all relative. And we see in various societies, including the US, the dangers and the ease with which politicians and other thought leaders can kind of capitalize on that lack of critical thinking and capitalize on that kind of assumption that if there's no one answer, then everything's up for grabs. And so that's the particular challenge in the interface that I think a number of you have discussed, this issue of professional history, the history that people tell each other within their families, and the histories that the takes on history that get promoted by particular kinds of regime, and how to what the place of thinking about scaffolding in particular, and carving out the position that just because there's no single narrative, that doesn't mean there's no rigor and no kind of basis for the arguments that we're making.
Thank you very much, Keith. I'll move right away to Nena, and then then we can have the last question. But first, Nena, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yes, I would also say, or also turn to the local. I think this is very productive, focusing on the local, maybe not calling it transnational, but beyond national, or concerning the relation between the national state who tries to nationalize society, because we also have to, I mean, this is self-understanding, but maybe I should mention it nevertheless, to have in mind that there is every time a tension between the actors, the protagonists of the nation state and society. It's never identical. Society and nation states are not the same. And this was, for me, in my fieldwork, in this local context on both sides of the Serbian-Bulgarian border, very, very visible. And also concerning remembrance, because in my field research or my book about this border region, it became clear to me that a large part of the individuals of the local society denies themselves any meaning, especially with regard to history. Their own experiences, the experiences of friends and relatives, are seen as worthless and irrelevant with regard to the great Bulgarian, great Serbian history. They remain in a subaltern or ambiguous sphere. And I think this is not only characteristic of this region, but it's characteristic for several regions in the Balkans. But this was really interesting to me, that they say the perception is shaped by the fact that there are people from the periphery. They are not part of this great history. We have nothing to say, is often said. And in addition, for example, I just turn very shortly to the period of the split of Yugoslavia from the Soviet bloc in 1948, which was had very severe also consequences in this region. Many traumatizing experiences are additionally blocked precisely on the basis of conviction of their own irrelevance. We have nothing to say, and there is no public space for this personal stories, for this for this family stories. And as I said, this became clear to me when it came to the time of IB, when I talked with people, where this border villages had much to suffer, and mostly nobody wanted to tell about it. Only, and this was very interesting, with the new possibility of rehabilitation for the victims of the so-called Inform Bureau, which was introduced in Serbia before some years ago. Then there was a possibility developing to articulate this traumatizing experiences of these people. and who at that time experienced this as children, how fathers, etc., relatives were taken away and were permanently stigmatized after their return from Goli Otok or from other prisons. So I think what is really not only in this area and this region important is a critical focus, critically thinking focus on local history. And from there, you can develop the tensions which are every time connected with this national framing. And this is also important for me because to create this space and the self-confidence for such stories, because they will disappear eventually. They will be forgotten. And after that, all that is left is a state-centered construction of history that does not refer to any experience and is completely abstract towards it. And the forgetting of this very concrete stories of very concrete people, this is something we have to work with because to give history not only this reified shape as it has in the national context by these protagonists of the national state. So this will be a very short reflection. I hope it's not too misunderstanding on this question.
Thank you very much, Nena. I think once again, we heard about the importance of marginalized stories, of stories that are not vocalized in official history teaching or official public presentations of history. And yeah, what several times you, but also I think Natalie mentioned the importance of critical thinking that doesn't, and that again can be only achieved through what Eckhardt said, through multi-perspectivity, and multi-perspectivity has to include different perspectives, but not just histories of different, for example, nationalities or ethnicities living in one country, but also what many of you mentioned, family stories or individual stories. That comes across to me as a very important, for me personally, conclusion from this round of comments, the importance of critical thinking as a very important component for the whole education, but in history in particular. I only would like to say, I also agree with Natalie on when she said that revisionism is not necessarily attached or to kind of transnational ways of thinking about history or strategics, but doing history research. And in fact, the case of Macedonia, for example, and now what's happening with the history commissions, it's actually a kind of reverse project. It is a way of revisiting history books by historical commissions, but it's not a transnational approach at all. Actually, it is the opposite. It is kind of a negotiation process, which I think I think it can be very pessimistic, that can be successful because there are very clear national agendas there, and also some kind of a power positions included, where one country might be in a better position than the other, because in this case Macedonia wants to enter EU and need to be given access. So there has to be negotiation and on historical issues, which are not just something left to the public or to the politicians, but really they are directly decisive, kind of they're involved in that decision making about concrete political processes and EU integration processes. There's not much time to discuss this, but I really would like to hear what is your opinion on how historical commissions, how this worked in the past, and how this history wars, which also somebody mentioned it before, how could they be solved? And if I can move now also to the third question, what are the escape routes of processes where exchange between intellectuals across Europe, different regions, will not end into ethno-nationalism, but rather the opposite, will open routes for transnational research. And I'm afraid that what's happening at the moment with the Macedonian Greek and Macedonian Bulgarian commissions, it's exactly the opposite. It's not opening a space for transnational research, it's actually the opposite. It's guarding your own containers of national historical knowledge. So how do you see that cooperation in future? How do you see what are the possible pathways to have kind of a more constructive historical discussions across Europe to achieve what is the European goal of shared heritage, shared histories, and so on. I would leave now the floor open, whoever wants to start first, and then we can move to the next. Yes, Eckhardt, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I just want to take up your reference to the History Commission. We see in this particular case, of course, the restraints, right, and the problems that are connected with that. But on the other hand, to me, they are also not the solution, but a good way out, and as an escape route, as you mentioned in your question. What I mean with that, what I mean with that is. Researching transnational also implies to me doing transnational, and that is not only confined to professional elite historians. Just let me give you a few examples. When I mean we should be transnational, means to me using and even founding trans or international organizations, or using existent networks, because they bring together, first of all, different stakeholders from different countries, be it civil society, be it professionals, be it political stakeholders. They produce common material. I will say a little bit more about it, and they provide the data that is necessary. To have a multi-perspective narrative, I have to know other narratives, right, before I can even think about it. And when it comes to history teaching and textbook revision, talking about objects and material, then there are, of course, different levels. There are these bilateral commissions. I mean, it's a history commission, but what they deal is, of course, also with textbooks and how these contested, so to say, interpretations of history can be or cannot be included in textbooks. We have regional activities and we have global activities. And just to give you a few examples, on the non-governmental level, there are networks that exist, and it can be used. Euroclio and Europe, everybody probably knows it. The European Association of History Teachers, who have been a tremendous work when it comes to the revision of textbooks on the bilateral and multilateral level. There are national institutions like my institute who have been engaged for decades in those activities. And coming back to Joanna, because I know this Polish case you mentioned before, the revisionist reform in Poland, because we just finished the 4th volume of a common German-Polish history textbook, which actually has a transnational and multi-perspective perspective. It will be very complicated to get it into Polish schools. In Germany, it's a little bit easier. But we have other cases, and we have the Israel-Palestinian common textbook that was written by teachers. We have in East Asia, where we have the history forum that was established in 2003, and this was civil society. They were mainly teachers, some professors, no money, no budget, nothing, local historians, and not like I'm sorry for coming up with that, Joanna, again, no elitary cosmopolitan historians who are well funded. No, and they came up with the transnational textbook on transnational history of East Asia, new approaches, and of course that's the first step. I mean, the second step is, of course, to somehow get it into schools and train teachers to use these new perspectives. So these are a lot of activities, and they can be used, and I know they exist in the Balkan too. And some of them are successful, some of them are less successful. In the case you just mentioned, of course, this historical commission, because it's political misused, right? And what I talk is more the civil society, bottom-up, non-state guided work. Just let me give you two last examples, and I stop on a governmental level. In Europe, the Council of Europe has established or is about to establish a history observatory for peace in Europe, with the goal to promote European values and to develop a European conscience, with reports, with recommendations, with textbook analysis, with the analysis of practices of historical teaching in European countries. We don't know how it goes and where it goes, but by now 21 European countries have signed that an enlarged partial agreement, but that's a state initiative, so we have to know what we do right now here at my institute, and I just mentioned it was one sentence. We are about to establish a European Forum for Reconciliation and Cooperation in History and Social Sciences, where we try to bring together those several activities, bio multilateral activities in Europe, to bind them together, maybe to develop standards, to find ways how to overcome these problems we have when it comes to these contested memories, and how they can find their way in textbooks, and ideally then in the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you, Eckhardt. Natalie, I see wants to. Yes.
Yes, I want to tackle another issue that seems to me important, because also of some remarks that were made before, the issue of the narrative, even of the form of the narrative. We said that we spoke about, so I think Joanna and Keith, about emotions. The fact that history should be attractive also through emotions, and that also the narrative has to be not too complex in order to be understandable. So I think that for historians, people who were writing textbooks and others, maybe one of the main issue is the issue of the narrative, and maybe the circulation of models can be also of a certain utility. For example, again in France, excuse me, 3 years ago appeared a book that produced a polemic. In fact, it was the book edited by Boucheron and others, entitled l'Histoire mondiale de la France, so the world history of France, and in fact the polemics was between these historians and, so let's say, transnational historians, but other historians that were not revisionist at all. In a way, they were the people around the book Les lieux de mémoire, so a very important book. So it's more complicated. But what also the Boucheron and his colleagues did, it was to structure the book around dates. So 1492, for example, and so to explain history, so the world dimension of French history through dates. So here the narrative is quite simple. And I think also that another phenomenon, because we spoke about historians, we spoke about political leaders, we spoke about the public opinion, and what about the writers, the novelists, for example? You have in the last years several examples of very important books that brought important contribution to the field of history, but that were written by novelists. So people like, for example, Javier Cercas, the Spanish author. Lastly, this Italian writer, Scurati, who wrote a biography of, began to write a biography of Mussolini. And so this, there is a debate on the, the relation between fiction and history, and I think it's very related to what we are trying to imagine as solutions also for changing and proposing new way of disseminating a more complex in the content, but not in the form.
Thank you, Natalie. Who would like to go next with a final remark, I would say, and yes.
Just a last point. Also, they are, as an historian, I am trying now to also to propose something maybe a bit new in my last book that I am finishing now on the building of a nation state, so the Albanian nation state in the 1920s and 1930s, and through a prism, a triple prism: space, time, and trajectories. So here we have again the attempt to grasp history through the personal trajectories, but not only, also the issue of time with multiple temporalities, and also of spaces, also the entanglement of different spaces. So it's another attempt.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, if Joanna, would you like to go next with the final remark? And then Nena and Kitten, after that, I would like to open the floor for at least 10 minutes to have for the audience also to engage. Thank you.
Yeah, just maybe very, very briefly referring to that, what Kees was saying, because I really like that metaphor, if I might say, or a question. How can we, what can we use with the example of teaching science in school when we transfer that to history? Because that would, your example, if I understood it well, would imply that okay, they teach it in a simplified way, the model, which later on you can grasp in more details. My question to you as a historian would be, do we really need to teach them? Because what would be that thing which we need to teach them? Is it a narrative? So do we need to really teach them a narrative? If not, and it's enough to teach them an approach, right, which is a critical approach, that the so-called multi-perspective or agonistic approach, then there's only a question of which level we practice that approach. We can do it, as you argue, on the local approach. We can do it on some other scale. Probably the local is the most easy to grasp and to involve the people with. Then obviously is a question if then there are certain lieux de mémoire which still at the nation level or some other level, European level, whatever, global level, we want the people to grasp in. Can we afford that they do not know who Martin Luther King was, like that, or Robert Schuman was, or the first king of Poland was? Maybe in the time of Wikipedia we can, right? So that maybe it's just the approach is enough. And then also my other question, I think, to just an open question or an open remark to that, because we have a lot discussed this transnational and multi-ethnic perspective, but there are the others around us which are being forgotten by the history, which is mainly still in the handbooks, most of the handbooks, especially in Eastern Europe, very politically oriented. So like gender history, right? That's something which we can do, and we can also practice this on the local level. And if we open that perspective to the other, and that perspective, then maybe it's easier when they grow up to to open the scope of the understanding, and also the thing that the history is a narrative. It's making the narrative, and they have to be critical about that the narratives, and look for the narratives of the others. So yeah, that's my final statement before the discussion. But I really would like to answer one of the Michelle's questions later on, which is great.
Yes, as you can see, there are already questions coming in, and Michele already posted one. Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much for bringing the others, which I think are also very important. Nena, do you want to say your final remark and answer the question?
Final remark. Encouraging subjectivity, of course. I mean, subjectivity in the sense of the possibility of critical judgment. I think this is very general, and I would like to begin with it, or to do this very local. In my case, I think what is very important is for example, cooperation of local museums on both sides of any kind of any borders in the Balkans, because the people on both sides have the same experiences, but they often do not know about it. And I think this is something where you can start with kids from school, that they can learn something about their family. They maybe didn't know until now, because it was not en vogue to talk about such things. And when such kind of space emerges, also this kind of subjectivity emerges. And I would just like to add something. I think literature can be really, 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 really inspiring for us. Just as this approach of subjectivity, I don't know, Miljenko Jergović, for example, a writer from Sarajevo, now in Zagreb, he wrote a great book before some years, Rod, on Serbo-Croatian or Croatian, however. And I don't know if it is translated in English, but in German it is. It has the really not very inspiring title of the unheard history of my family. But nevertheless, and this is really good, because it shows in a really long time span how is it possible to live with ambiguities. Yeah, if someone is not part of this nation, but is just a kuferash, how it's called, coming from somewhere else to live in this place. And I think this is something which can us inspire to tackle this commissions and to have some kind of energy to keep our nerves then in this talks and negotiations. So these are my final words.
That's very nice. Thank you, Nena. Kit.
I just my third slide was, as you would have anticipated, about the Vevčani work, but I won't go into that in the same depth. But just I'd like to first of all thank everyone, and also I just put in the chat, if Natalie and Nena, can you share the book references you both mentioned, just because I'd love to follow up on those. I hope we'll address Michelle's questions more fully, but I'm very conscious in the victim-perpetrator frame of, as Joanna said, the others. So teaching in a state where, Arizona, where the realities of US settler colonialism and the price exacted from people, indigenous inhabitants and people of color in the forging of America makes the victim-perpetrator frame it's going to be a long road to persuade U.S. public, the diminishing demographic of folks who have lived comfortably in their white privilege their whole lives, to come to terms with that. So again, just flagging that these are not just issues in the region. And then the last thing, just I would add to subjectivity, and it's a little bit of a response to Joanna's question. I mean, for me, as my historian colleagues in Skopje consistently point out to me, I'd really rather be writing novels. And for me, it's all about sparking the imagination, but sparking the cognitive imagination to so history, particular capacity to provoke habits of cognitive empathy, and that does pose a challenge, because I don't see. I think people talk about empathy as a scalar, that is, we build more, we have a notion that we just fill people up with more and more empathy. But for me, especially as an anthropologist who was reared on Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, right, which made its way into historical discussion as well. Empathy has vectors, and so the two truths, living with two truths that Nena just flagged, is part of the human condition, which is we can be incredibly connected with people who somehow we think of as having experiences like us, at the same time as being tremendously disconnected or seeing those that experience of closeness as threatened if we try and expand it out in new directions. But that for me is the challenge of this notion of like, you know, where the, I want to know more about this phantom borders work, but where the borders of the human imagination are they in the same, does everyone have the potential to transcend them? And you know, are there enough emotional and material resources whereby history can be, history doesn't, we don't need to cut it up into pieces that different people possess wholly for themselves, but rather we imagine it as a shared resource from which everyone can draw. You know, that's kind of fantasy utopian land, but that seems to me the project that we should be engaged on. And for me, I'm endlessly encouraged by the fact that I find some of the most humane, connected, and empathic people who I've ever met live in a small village in Western Macedonia and are continuing to struggle towards a kind of more just and fair world in which in which it matters what actually happened in 1987 and 1968 and 1948. It matters, and they know, and sort of embrace. And what they demonstrate to me is it's actually much easier to, if you sort of commit to telling truth rather than lies, it just makes for a much simpler life. And I think politicians, especially in the US, could learn from that.
Thank you so much, Kate, for this final remark. I think it was a beautiful closure, including empathy and seeing history as a shared source that everybody can draw from, rather than something that needs to be cut and everybody needs to own a piece of it. If you allow me now, I would like to open now the floor for several questions. And as I said, we already have a question from Michele. I'll read it loud. It says, it's to Nena and others. While dealing with the past involving victims and perpetrators, we deal with facts, memory, history in interconnected, even contrasted triangle. How would you see these three concepts? Camus says there is one truth, but the truth has multiple faces. What else besides multi-perspectivity and critical thinking? I think this is the second question. I'll read it also, and then later maybe you can. What else besides multi-perspectivity and critical thinking towards history would contribute to inclusive, constructive culture of remembrance? Do novels, movies, songs, theater, plays not make more for reconciliation than history we teach in schools? Anybody wants to answer the questions? Or the first one I think was to Nena, but also the others. So.
I think I think this is a very, very important reflection, and I think we answered it also quite a bit concerning literature, and this counts also for other moments of art and concerning this famous German word Verarbeitung of history. Processing is something not really adequate, but maybe a kind of translation for this. Yes, I mean, it is not only a task of history, and this is, as I wanted to point out, something which needs an approach to society and to reflect on relations of power in society. And history is only a modest part, in my view, to offer research to encourage such discussions.
Thank you, Nena. I see Natalie wants to say something, and then Eckhardt.
A brief add to what I already said. It's maybe the fact that maybe we forgot the media, because in this power relationship, I think that we have also the media that are playing an important role. And the second point is that, so I spoke about literature, but cinema is also very important. And I want to mention the work of Peter Watkins. I don't know if you have heard about this filmmaker. And it's related to my first point, because it's someone who from the 1970s on produced and realized very important films about the problem of memory, history, and power and medias. And he, for example, he did a film on the Battle of Culloden in Great Britain. So when it was at the end of Scotland, I think. And in this film, in fact, he is interviewing people who are fighting on the battlefield. So it tries to give, it's a fiction, of course, because he could not go back to history, but he is giving the possibility to speak to the subalterns, the people who are fighting and why they are fighting. So they ask the people, why are you fighting? And one is saying, because I just followed my brother, or because this, or because of that. So, and here it gives to us to see the multiplicity of the reality, or of the truth, if you want to speak about truth. So please have a look at all the films of Peter Watkins.
Thank you, Natalie. Eckhardt, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, thanks. Coming back to the question, I would like to respond to that as much as I can. Besides multi-perspectivity and critical thinking, well, these are skills that are already very, very difficult to learn, and most of us will probably will have work on that until the rest of our life. Another category I can think of, and it links up to what we talked about emotions before, is empathy. I think empathy is a very important skill when you talk about history, and especially in a transnational perspective. Other ways of then about these novels and plays and other forms that can contribute to reconciliation. Well, I don't know. There are no studies. We don't know what is more effective. No answer with that. But what I want to say is, of course, there are many ways of creating memory, and the public, the media, the family, novels, movies, textbooks, but they all, and that is very important, I want to say, is they all have a narrative. And it might be a national narrative or the other one. So when we talk about narrative, like a national narrative, we don't talk about like the chronology of some kind of nation from its founding to the present term. Narratives can a single image contains a narrative, a novel contains a narrative, a movie contains a narrative, and we have to deconstruct it when we talk about narratives. And in that respect, textbooks don't differ when we talk about narratives, not much from novels or comics or whatever, because they all have implicit narratives in there. The particularity of textbooks compared to other media, say movies and novels, is that in most countries of the world, every person, every student has to read a textbook if he or she likes it or not. But reading a novel, or watching a movie, it's very individual. You can do it, you don't have to. A textbook you have in your hand. And of course, there has been discussions for decades how effective textbooks are, and we have known for a long time that the contents of textbooks does not end up in the brain of the student, that there are so many different layers in between. We all know that. But yet, those narratives, when we talk about national, transnational, or some other narratives, every medium, whatever we look at, it contains that. Last thing, what Joanna asked, like, what is in the textbooks? Do they learn about, should students learn about Luther or Schumann, or you take it, right? Here my answer would be, well, this is exactly the result of negotiations in society. That should be the result. Should not be a single politician that decides, well, we don't teach colonialism anymore, right? Like in France, where we had this huge debate a couple of years ago, or we don't do this, or I want to have this in there, I want to have only kings, whatever it is. No, it should be the result of a negotiation process of a lot of stakeholders in one society. And then they come to a result. Do they want to teach Luther or not? And they will have an answer for that. But there's no general answer. So I wouldn't say everybody should learn about Luther or Schumann. That would be my response to your question, Joanna. Thank you.
I see Joanna. Yes.
Yeah, if I could just quickly come back to Michelle's first questions, which I really like, which was why dealing with the past involving victims and perpetrators, we deal with facts, memory, history in an interconnected, even contrasted triangle. How would you see these three concepts? And I just want to recall the very beautiful notion by James Wertsch, who is the social psychologist, but he dealt with he actually analyzed a lot of the post-Soviet Union and Russian textbooks, looking for something which we called master narrative behind them. And he says, and that's application of that research and also other research he did. He says that it's kind of easier, that it's even possible to agree for the conflicting parties to agree on the facts, but they might not agree on a narrative. And the narrative will be always kind of behind and lagging behind that. So when we have the cases like Jedwabne in Poland or Babi Yar in Ukraine, where the local population was involved in the killing of Jewish population there, you know, at the end of the historical commission and other people who saying, they finally we agree, okay, so that number of the people actually died there. But still, then there is a narrative behind that. And even if they agree about the identity of the perpetrators and the victims, each of the side might of the conflicting side of that might start the story somewhere else. So let's say, well, there were some Poles involved, but generally that was the occupied Poland, so Germans were there, so they're guilty. And then the other points will say that no, that has been that eternal Polish Catholic anti-Semitism, which actually, put that event into motion. And this is what he calls mnemonic standoff. So it's not about the facts, but it's about the narratives which are behind the facts and which can both use actually the same facts, but they would be very, very different. Yeah. So
thank you very much, Joanna. We are running a little bit out of time, and but I do want to do justice to also the other participants. So if there's any other burning question, I would like to ask the participants to actually unmute themselves, and they can address the question directly to the panelists. So please, whoever wants to ask a question, go ahead. I think we have time for maybe one or maximum two questions.
Hello, good evening. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Good evening.
Okay. Thank you so much for organizing this discussion. It's very interesting to listen to all of you. But I have one question. Since I'm studying human rights and democracy in Southeast Europe, and I have a question actually concerning wider European context, so beyond Southeastern Europe, because we were tackling several issues and also transnational justice and transitional justice. So I would like to ask you concerning this wider European context, as already said, and the process of reconciliation. Is it possible that in those societies with political transitions, where transitional justice has provided opportunities to address past human rights abuses, mass atrocities, or other forms of severe trauma, to facilitate, let's say, smooth transition into a more democratic or a peaceful future? So is it possible to apply and accomplish, at least at some extent, and at what extent as well is the question, full reconciliation with understanding torture, enforced disappearance in the past, and to enable memorialization in the future? So is it possible in those societies to achieve full reconciliation under all of these circumstances?
Thank you, Ayla. Is there anybody in particular that you would like to answer? Do you address the question to somebody in particular?
No, because all of the panelists are from very interesting backgrounds, so I would like to hear all of them if they are interested to answer this question. And thank you so much.
Okay, I would like only to kindly ask you to keep it a bit brief because we're really out of time now. So yes, whoever feels inspired to answer the question. Kit, yes, and then Eckhardt.
So that's a huge and tough question. One of the things that it makes me think about in connection with some of the other panelists is just to what extent we think that the work of the historian is to provide closure. because that's clearly a kind of justice-centered narrative. The shape of a judicial narrative is judgment and a sort of finality to that. And for me, at least, if we allow our historical work to be, if we prioritize framing our historical work in that modality, in other words, with the idea of coming up with the answer, which assigns responsibility and reckoning and reparations, then we are kind of surrendering a kind of piece of the epistemological space of what some of us are trying to do, which is provoke openness and sort of, ironically, sort of future-facing openness and critical thinking. So critical thinking in order to recognize multiple perspectives. So I heard what you say. There's a kind of, there is a sort of difference between the truth and reconciliation modality and the justice modality. But I think that the work of transnational history, at least for me, sits a little bit outside that frame.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kid. Eckhardt, I think you wanted also to say something.
Just two sentences because of the time constraints
Yes.
we have here. I think in those truth and reconciliation committees that exist in a variety of countries, we know it of course from South Africa and in Latin America in many cases, historians play a major role. I mean, they are very decisive actors in those commissions, but those commissions also show the limitations of historians, how far they can go. They can find let's say the truth that comes in many faces, but let's say the truth. But it needs to come in society to really, if to reach justice and reconciliation, it needs the political will. And that there I see very much limitations of historians, because no matter how true the accounts are of those commissions, if there's no political will to basically incorporate that in different areas of society, and education is certainly one, museums, whatever you can name it. Without political will, I don't think there's any success. But even if there's a political will, when we talk about it, we talk about a long time and patience. It's nothing that can be reached in a few years. But you're an expert, you study it, so I don't have to tell you that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're 15 minutes over time, and I actually would love to accept even more questions if there are any, but yes, since we're running late, I actually would like to conclude the discussion for today, and I would like to thank everybody who joined us for the discussion, both on Zoom but also on our YouTube channel. And I, of course, particularly would like to thank all our panelists today who took the time, and I'm really grateful for the very valuable contributions. I believe we not just addressed some very important issues, but also we opened some very important and crucial questions. Actually, the discussion will continue tomorrow with a second panel, where we're going to zoom in more into the Southeastern European context. And I would like to invite everybody of you who would like to continue the discussion, who has questions, also to, or just to listen, please join us tomorrow for the second panel. Thank you again, everybody, for your very kind contributions, and I hope to see you in some other opportunity, maybe in life one day. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. Greetings from Skopje.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Всичко